My name is Jack McLean. I'm your host, and today my guest is Paul Devlin. Paul has over 20 years experience at almost every layer of the sports industry. He spent 10 years as a professional rugby player across Europe before pivoting into high-performance coaching, where he managed staff in sports science, sports medicine, and strength and conditioning departments. Paul has consulted to many sports technology companies across the last 10 years and also has extensive executive coaching experience. Paul's an MBA from AGSM in Sydney and is currently studying LLM International Sports Law in practice at Sheffield University in the UK. Key topic for today's chat will be all about how to use data to drive decision-making in high-performance sport. Before we start this episode, for those new to our podcast, our mission here at Prepare Like a Pro is to inspire aspiring athletes and staff with practical knowledge from some of the industry's most inspiring individuals and to strengthen the AFL community. If you like the show, please show support by following us on Instagram and subscribing to the podcast. We're on iTunes, Spotify, and YouTube. Thanks for jumping on, Paul.
Thanks for having me, Jack. Appreciate it.
Yeah, looking forward to our chat, and take us back to the very beginning, mate. As I mentioned in the intro, professional player for 10 years there. At what age did you discover you had a talent and a passion and drive to be an elite athlete?
Yeah, so thanks for the intro. Very humbling intro. But I grew up obviously I'm in Australia now, but grew up, as you can tell from the accent, northwest, or hopefully I still got it, northwest England, Widnes, just outside Liverpool. And so for anyone listening who grew up there or knows anyone who grew up there, it's rugby league and football, as in soccer in Australia and America. And they were the games we played. Not really rugby union back then. I'm old enough that rugby union wasn't really the thing back then for most people, unless you went to a posh private school. I wasn't good enough at football, unfortunately, much as I really wanted to be, a big Everton fan. But I was pretty aggressive and willing to work really hard. I had good mentors, and both my parents are exceptionally hardworking. My uncle Kevin over in Ireland had played rugby. My dad had played rugby. My dad was my coach growing up. But to be totally truthful, I didn't get many accolades, really. I mean, I played rep teams and whatnot growing up, but it wasn't until I hit about 17 and my dad asked me to try rugby union. I remember at first going, no way, I'm not playing rugby union. I'd only gone professional a few years before, and I played a few games, and I got so lucky. A local scout had been watching, and he picked me for the kind of regional team in Lancashire, and then I got picked for the north of England, and then I ended up playing for England, the under-18s, and I'd only played like 6 games of rugby union in my whole life. I did not know the rules particularly well, but I found that I was a bit more physically developed than some of the guys there. There was very early days in professional rugby union, and very fortunate to play for England in that tournament, and Sale Sharks in the English Premiership offered me a 3-year contract to go full-time professional after college. And so I'm 18, just about turned 18, and I jumped in and went full-time professional with Sale Sharks. And it's funny looking back now, catch up with that team, some of the people out of that team still to this day. And there's no academies back then. There was no real development programs. It was, all right, Paul, you're a man now, get in there. No, professionalism was a little bit different than it is now. And I basically jumped in with a bunch of men who'd only themselves gone full-time professional the year before, because rugby union had only changed. And, some very smart guys in there. There was lots of lawyers and doctors and whatnot who've now become professional rugby players, but it was a very different environment for an 18-year-old than it is today. But yeah, very exciting time for me and my career. I was very fortunate that my career progressed from there. It wasn't all positive at all. It was probably, I'd look back, say, mostly challenging and recovering from failures, or what I perceived as failures. Other people might have thought I was doing really well, but to me, I probably never achieved my potential. I was very lucky and fortunate to play in some amazing places, but I think it's hard when you finish playing. I haven't played for 10 years, and you look back, and it's hard to justify whether it was a success or not unless you won lots of grand finals. And a bit harsh on myself probably, but yeah, that was how it started, Jack.
Yeah, great experience, like you said, as an 18-year-old, wide-eyed, to get thrown straight in the deep end, so to speak, and just work it out. But looking back now, in terms of now having hindsight that you worked in the career that you have, do you think that passage of your athletic career set you up with like fundamentals of resilience to handle high pressure and working in an environment like high performance sport?
Yeah, no question. And so my career from there at Sale progressed. I went back to Super League. I went over to Ireland and was very fortunate to play at Munster for 3 years. And we had an amazing time over there. And then I went and played in the top 14 in France for a bit and then came back to the UK. And I was hit by challenges all over the place there. Challenges with, I actually think, looking back, and I've said this before to teams I've coached, I've been fortunate but unfortunate as a player in that I had experience as the young player in the team who's been identified as talented and been thrown in to see how he goes. The player who's played regularly, the player who's not playing regularly and isn't quite sure why, or the coach doesn't like me. I've had that experience too many times. I've had player who's injured. I had 9 knee surgeries and retired when I was 29 because of knee injuries. Mostly knee injuries. But so been that guy who 2 ACLs, 2 microfracture surgeries. And so the recovery from them is an experience that I think allowed me to I was married and I'm married to a physiotherapist from sport as well. And so the accumulation of those experiences when I did move into strength and conditioning, as well as the resilience that you noted earlier, it definitely helped me feel like I could connect to whatever layer a player was at and I have a genuine appreciation of at least my experience of how they might be feeling. I definitely think that helped me as I kind of moved into the strength and conditioning world. It's very different in, say, France as a comparison in how they prepare athletes as opposed to Ireland, as opposed to England or Australia. So lots of experiences definitely helped me.
Yeah, that's actually a good and probably a little bit off topic, but the different ways that teams and countries and cultures prepare for performance, like how do you sort of adapt from an athlete's perspective to maybe something that doesn't resonate with you straight away, but to have that open mindset to, okay, well, I'll see this as an opportunity to learn as it's different. And have you had moments, maybe early on in your career where that had surprised you, where a different way actually worked quite well?
Yeah, it's so pertinent to me, that question, because I was playing in France in the top 14 and it's a massive league, but I went over there from Munster after we'd won the European Cup and signed for a team. It was their first year. So in France, the towns, the village, in my case, Albi, when they get promoted, it's like it's the whole town, the whole village. One cool thing is all the local wineries provide wine for the players, which was lovely. But I was playing in France and I'd gone from Munster I'd gone from Super League where there was a level of professionalism. I thought players have been full-time professional for a long time. Went to Munster where they're still kind of learning it, but it was full of like the most elite players, incredible internationals. The majority of the team were internationals or British Lions. But they were still learning like what is full-time professional environment like in Munster at the time. So I felt like I was able to help them a little bit in that respect from my experiences, even being young. Then went to France and it was like, wow, this is so different. Like in France, I turned up to the first gym session and the gym was locked. And when I got in, there wasn't 2 sets of dumbbells the same weight, and I was like, what? I could not believe it. And that was where I first encountered strength and conditioning, actually, because, I'd had some good strength and conditioning coaches. A guy, Marty Hume, helped me. He was at Sale Sharks. It was a massive influence on me as a player. I still speak to him today, still take his advice today. But what started happening was a lot of the foreigners, I couldn't speak French particularly well at the start. So talking like the Canadian boys, South Africans, Welsh lads over there at the time, they were a bit frustrated by the training because it was play to train rather than train to play. So everything was just, let's play a game, put tackle suits on and belt the hell out of each other for 60 minutes. Like the night before a game, we would play a 60-minute game, 13 on 13, even though it was Rubinian, no kicking, just belt each other. And, I was at the time, I got to say, I probably whinged nonstop. It was no wonder the coach didn't particularly like me. But we never did conditioning today. Like at Munster, they used to run us hard. We had a really good strength and conditioning coach there, Damien Mednis, Australian guy. And so he'd run us hard. And I went over to France and they never did run it, ever. We had a S&C coach who was actually, I found out, one of the French sprint coaches. So I'd wondered why his speed sessions were so good, but that's all he cared about. No gym work, gym was optional. And so I started running sessions for the players. I was Googling, I was going back, plagiarizing the hell out of people like Ashley Jones and Kelvin Giles, anyone who put anything on the internet. I was downloading it and copying it. And I started running sessions. I was running gym sessions, but mostly I was running conditioning sessions. twice a week for a top 14 rugby team that I was playing in.
Wow.
And
what a unique experience.
what was cool, yeah. So some of the players started saying that they felt like it was helping them. They felt like they were a bit fitter. And so then I moved back to the UK, and I did a master's degree. I started a master's degree at St Mary's University in London, and in strength and conditioning science. And like I've got to say, at the time, I wasn't earning a great deal of money when I came back from France, and I really thought this investment in my career would be a good opportunity. Well, it didn't feel like work to me running conditioning sessions. It was, gym sessions. It was so much fun. I had my wife there doing a master's in sports physiotherapy at the same time, so I was learning a heap around corrective exercise and how to improve, say, running mechanics or movement in the gym, how to correct poor postures, that sort of stuff. And so, yeah, I think I realized at that point I had a really big passion for helping people. Like, I got a real pleasure in that team environment of scrum half, Morgan Williams coming to me and saying, I feel a bit fitter now. And I wasn't testing or anything. I wasn't running a proper program. We were doing it to try and help ourselves. But him saying, I actually feel like I've really benefited from these sessions. And they were Ashley Jones's sessions. They weren't mine, but I was running them. And so I was starting to feel like this would be great. It feels good to help people.
Rewarding. Yeah.
And it's like, at the end of the day, I'm standing holding a whistle if I'm not running myself. And so, I went about exploring the theoretical side of it. How do I write a session as good as him? To be able to potentially do this as a job. And that was kind of how my strength and conditioning career started, to be honest, doing a lot of work for free for a lot of different teams.
Yeah. Wow. That's got to be up there, if not the most unique S&C story I've ever heard. I reckon it definitely fairly different from someone who wanted to be an athlete, didn't work out and became an S&C. You actually were a pro athlete at the time, and stepping up and helping out the team in filling a hole. So that's at that moment, obviously you're putting all your energy into being the best athlete you can be, but it sounded like you started to fall in love with something at a slightly different angle. Is that where you started to think, maybe the coach's hat? Obviously you're doing your master's, so you're thinking a little bit further on from your career as an athlete at that point.
Yeah, definitely. And then I moved back to the UK and I played at a club I just loved, it, Cornish Pirates, which is in the second tier of English rugby. And we had a coach who, quite frankly, was probably too good for us. Actually, we had an amazing bunch of players. One of my fondest memories at times in that 3-year period. Chris Sterling was in New Zealand. He ended up coaching with the All Blacks coaching group a number of years later. Phenomenal coach. But I was playing over there, and this is an interesting story actually about how I eventually landed my first S&C gig. I was invited to play in a World Sevens tournament in Italy with some of the other players, and so we flew over to Rome, and it was basically a really good guy, a wealthy businessman who pulled in a load of players in the off season to play in this tournament and kind of enjoy it and see how we go. So we weren't exactly ultra professional, but ironically, Alex Natera, who's incredibly good strength and conditioning coach, he helped me early in my career because he helped me get onto the master's degree, firstly at St Mary's, and then he also was the strength and conditioning coach in this team when we were away in Rome. And long story short, we get to the semi-final, get to the final, and I went to put a crazy sidestep on and did my ACL a second time. And this was 2 days before preseason started at my club. And so I was now in a really poor position. So I got back, the owner flew back. He lived in Kenya, the owner of the team, he flew back, and he just said, you're fired, you're gone. And yeah, I was in trouble because my wife at the time was on maternity leave with our second daughter. So I had 2 kids under 3, and I just lost my job, and I had I was doing my master's, I had no qualifications. I was in a real hole. And through a number of strong conversations with the CEO and the head coach really went into bat for me. I managed to convince them that I could be an assistant strength and conditioning coach for the year because I was going to miss the season, and that I would do a little bit on nutrition as well because I've been studying that, and would they just give me a go? I was in that team. I was paid reasonably well for the group because some of the players even in that team were part-time. But anyway, they backed me, thankfully. And so I did. I became kind of an assistant S&C whilst I did my rehab. And then amazingly, and I loved it, and it was great. And I was doing lots of work in the evenings as well. Finished it off my master's. And then the assistant coach from that team moved up to Doncaster Knights, and he asked me to go with him as the strength and conditioning coach. And so I became a head of strength and conditioning, the head of, meaning I was the only one. But yeah, I got so lucky, Jack. I was genuinely at the trapdoor of having to just go out, you know, as a trade or doing something. If I hadn't landed it, well, if Chris hadn't helped to convince the CEO that I would add value as an assistant strength and conditioning coach there.
Sliding door moments, eh?
Definitely, mate. Yeah. I always remember it as well when I think about how hard it is to crack a career. You know, there's some people, I've been helped enormously by some very, very good people over the years. And I got very lucky in that one. And I think about it when I see, you know, young S&C coaches now trying to find their way and help any way I can, because I've been there. I know exactly what it's like. Yeah,
I guess that's probably a good segue for the S&Cs listening in that are, you know, persisting in trying to get that exposure, and they're in maybe community level programs or state level programs, semi-professional environments. What are some advice that you've provided to S&Cs in a mentoring space, or even S&Cs that you've worked with as colleagues to keep getting better and, I guess, opening up more doors in elite sport?
Yeah, I think relationships are key. Earning your right and earning your way is hard in proving that you've got a good work ethic. I said before, both I was very lucky that I grew up in an environment in Northwest England where you kind of I felt like everybody just worked really hard. Certainly my parents did, and the rest of my wider family. And then I was lucky again that I went into a working class environment at Sale Sharks, even though a lot of the rugby union players back then, and still to this day, I suppose, in the UK, are private school educated, and there's a perception that they don't work as hard. I think that myth's gone now, that they do work bloody hard. But equally, the early on in my career, the influences were definitely in and around hard work and work ethic. So I think that's something that strength and conditioning world, it's super important in the elite world of sport. It's so ruthless that they kind of don't accept people who aren't prepared to work exceptionally hard. And I often use the term obsessed. I think you've got to be obsessed with your role. Otherwise, it's just not for you. Real, truly high performance. It's not for everybody. And that's okay. Some careers aren't. But if you truly want to be the best in the world, it's going to take a lot of sacrifice. So that's another one. But definitely, I think the world has evolved a lot since I started. The ability to gather information, assimilate information and learn from different people. You can do and again, COVID's probably exaggerated this even further, Jack, but you can there's podcasts, there's like we're on right now, right? But video coaching, apps like Coach's Eye, so you can review. None of that was available. Like, even we talk about something as simple as GPS tracking. I remember when I started, it was a piece of paper, pencil, and a stopwatch. And I know that makes me sound old, but it genuinely was like you had to find a way of tracking progress. And so the opportunities, I suppose, on one side, there's amazing opportunities for young S&C coaches to learn, but then there's also conflicting evidence. Back then, it was, if it's peer-reviewed research, then you can trust it because it's passed through a process of assessment for whether it's valid or not. Whereas now anyone can post anything to the internet and be an internet guru, right? And so that you have to have that, you have to develop that kind of bullshit filter, which is hard as an up-and-coming coach, because what I can remember thinking, well, I don't know who's right here. We've got contrasting views. But definitely they're kind of the biggest things. Is another experience of mine from starting off earlier, I think is the same today, is finding a way to survive financially, actually, when you're starting out in strength and conditioning.
Yeah, I was talking about that because we're talking about that off air. I think that'd be a good thing to sort of shed light on in terms of, knowing your worth. And I guess there's a certain amount of time where you said it's so competitive and it continues to be competitive at the top. Yeah. So I guess there's an element where not everyone can have jobs. So therefore, what's your sort of take on internships, if you like, and earning your way from putting in time early on in the career? Like, what's your take on it?
Yeah, when I started, they weren't really called internships. It was just, I just was a volunteer. And so I just went and helped out with lots of strength and conditioning stuff. And it was purely because I was so passionate about it. I really, really wanted to get better. And I felt like as I was learning more on this master's, I needed to experience experience it, and I wanted that feeling of coaching people and helping improve the way they move. I wanted to see how they adapted, all of those things. And so that was what I was supposed to doing, lots of internships. But as I was sharing to you earlier, that there's another side to that as well. Like the first 3 or 4 jobs I took, actually, right back to those Doncaster days, where I took that role, I kind of knew what sort of salary I would be getting paid, but I didn't really care about it, and I was definitely ridiculously underpaid. Definitely well into my NRL career over here, because I genuinely wasn't that bothered by it. And it sounds a bit stupid looking back now, but I mean it, and it's totally true. I really wasn't bothered about what I was being paid, as long as I was getting to do what I'd been, dreaming for a little while there of doing, and I felt like I could help. I always felt like it would work out in the end. And as I've got a bit older now, I possibly look back and think I did myself a little bit of a disservice there, and wouldn't be something I'd be recommending to people, because I probably did put my family under a bit of pressure there with, me at work and being so obsessed with it that, we had to move house a lot. It chopped and changed clubs a lot, and it's because I was constantly looking at how I could improve and how I could take on a bigger challenge, and would it be worth it, and never really looking at that. What are you going to pay me? So as the first question, it never was. Maybe it should have been a little bit, not the first question, but right up front. And then it goes back to internships. I feel like there is no kind of perfect answer here. I think internships, without them, I would never have progressed. There's no chance. Without the ability, and I used to try and pride myself when I was working in the NRL on taking on really, really good attitudes as an intern. And had, even in Super League when I worked at Hull FC, the girls there progressed on to become a head of sports science. Emily Wilson, who worked with us at South Sydney Rabbitohs, has had a sensational strength and conditioning career after working with us as an intern there. There's lots of them who've gone on to careers. I think if it leads to something, there's a genuine path. I did a lot of work with Tim Doyle at Macquarie University and taking some of his MSc students in. And there's always a pathway to how can we prepare them to be employable. So we put a genuine learning program in. Alex Natera, I think he also did an incredible job of that at the Giants. I remember going through it with him. And it's not just an internship where you come in and wash shakers. It's an education experience where, you know what, you might wash shakers. That's okay. I wash shakers too. That's part of running a performance environment, cleaning up the gym and whatever else. But making sure that it's a learning journey for them that will improve their employability, because they've been in a good program, they've seen what it's like, they've helped to contribute to it. I think there's value in internships there. Whether they should be paid, ideally, of course they would be. They'd be at least minimum wage. I think everybody would agree on that. But the reality of sport is there's a finite amount of money, and hopefully that continues to improve. But that's just life. There's a finite amount of money, and if the money's not available, and you're of the opinion, well, I'm not doing it then, that's fine. I think there'll always be someone who will. It's just finding that balance between how long am I prepared to do things for free, and then when do I actually need to put my family first and earn a reasonable living. That's the question everyone has to be able to answer themselves.
Yeah, well said. It's such a finicky section, but I think it resonates with your take on it. At the end of the day, I feel the same way. If I didn't do volunteer work, you're not going to be ready to then take on those and make an impact at more significant roles, if you call them that, where you do have responsibilities because you haven't put in the time. So you got to put practice in, and sometimes that's a matter of volunteer or internships, if you call that. But as long as the environment's helping people grow, then they're productive, opposed to being free labor, like you mentioned. So, well said, mate. For the experienced practitioners listening in, that you touched on, in hindsight, you would have liked to look after your family a little bit more and ask those questions from the finance, rather than just you beauty, I've got the high performance role now, or that I've climbed the ladder, or I'm at a more successful club, and focusing on that, which I think a lot of us tend to do, rather than focus on the finance side. But I'm sure we can do both and ask both questions. How would you have gone about that differently, and what would be some, questions that you'd like to ask in that setting before you dive straight into the next role?
Yeah, it's probably self-reflection. As I'm getting a bit older, I've started thinking about these things, Jack, to be honest. And when someone would approach me about a new opportunity, as you can tell, I'm reasonably passionate and enthusiastic. And I would just think that's an opportunity for me to get better. I can help them, you know, and on the times when I chose it, of course. And so I think having been a professional player, probably was very selfish. I was very, very driven. I was absolutely obsessed with trying to be the best I could be. Didn't feel like I had huge success, even though, you know, externally probably looks like I did. But it felt like a total roller coaster for me, and I was constantly chasing the dream. And I think I definitely carried that over into my strength and conditioning career, in that I desperately wanted to work with groups who I felt the same way as me. Probably in some ways, I look back and I landed in Australia, for example, and worked at Melbourne Storm, where that was exactly the environment. You know, everybody was obsessed. It was just constantly being challenged to get better. Any idea was listened to, as long as it was going to help the group. If you were prepared to put the team first, you know, they would listen. And so that probably sped up my obsession with getting better. And then I moved on to other clubs where it wasn't quite like that. And so I was trying to make it like that. And so I guess where I'd come back to is I didn't, and it's a fault on me, really sit down and think to myself when I would get opportunities, say, to move and take on a new challenge. That might sound awfully selfish, actually. It does now, I'm about to say it, but I didn't really think, how will this affect my family? I probably just justified, well, I'll work so hard and create such a good future for us that they'll be all right.
Yeah.
You know, and they were. So maybe I was right. But I do think, if, you know, as I'm getting older and I'm giving advice to people, like, just take a breath.
Yeah.
Just, you know, I heard Sam Burgess on a podcast recently say, just pause and look it over the horizon. I think that's a good way of looking at it. I think he stole that from Russell Crowe, and he said in the High Performance podcast with Jay Comfrey recently, it's a great quote. And I didn't do that well. And I think, would it have changed anything to do? I'm not sure, because I don't regret necessarily any decisions, but I have, through self-reflection, identified that my obsession with trying to be with a group that kind of wanted to be on the same path as me and would do anything to get better, meant that I kept chasing, looking for, you know, the next group that matched, I suppose, say, the group that I had at Munster that I played with, or the group that was like Melbourne Storm, who you just didn't feel like the outsiders were the people, and there wasn't many, who maybe just weren't, this is all I care about, this is my priority in life. But, you know, the world is changing. Not everybody is like that. But if I had my time again, I'd probably just look over the horizon a bit more when I was making those decisions, and whether that leads to a different outcome, I'm not quite sure.
Yeah, no, appreciate the insight, mate. It's the open honesty is great advice for those listening in, and you know, you never know how an impact that you might have made on someone now to ask that question and look after their family. So thank you. But looking back over your career, what are some highlights that sort of pop up first front of mind that you look back fondly and proud of?
Yeah, so definitely playing at Munster. My family are Irish, and my uncle played at Leinster, which is a rival province. I played with some incredible rugby players at Munster. I was lucky to play in European Cup. We won it. I was lucky to play in a cup final. So that was a really, really good time in my life. Definitely a career highlight, even though at the time it wasn't good enough. Like, at the time I felt like I wasn't happy. I look back now and think, what an idiot. But then I talked about the time at the Cornish Pirates, down there, second tier of English rugby, but absolutely incredible group of men and an outstanding coach. And we had some amazing times there. Some very good people who I keep in touch with. I think coaching wise then, definitely Melbourne Storm left an enormous mark on me. I'm very, very fortunate to stay in touch with the people there. They're just outstanding business and outstanding sports team. And then also, I think more recently, my second year at the Rabbitohs, actually, we had an outstanding group there, some very good people. I suppose that's the common denominator here, isn't it? I keep talking about great people, and that's what makes great teams. But we got one win from the grand final, beaten by the Roosters there. But I felt like that team, they'd been to a grand final and won it in 14, and I felt like the majority of that group were obsessed. Like, they were willing to pay the price to win, and we got very, very close to get into a grand final. And when you're involved with a group like that, it leaves a mark with you. I reckon.
Yeah. And the flip side, mate, some significant challenges you mentioned over your athletic career. So I guess from the athlete side, 2 ACLs and like you said, 9 surgeries. But there might be some other challenges as well, but also from a coaching perspective, what have you learned from those challenges when you look back on, and how'd you grow from it?
Yeah, definitely as a player, you've nailed it. As a player, my challenges were injuries and never being happy, which I suppose in some ways is a strength because it pushed me to achieve what I did achieve. But I mean, I genuinely don't reckon I was ever really happy. I played in a cup final. I started on the wing for Munster in a cup final, and they brought me off with 20 minutes to go. And I refused to have a picture with the trophy because I was like, nah, I didn't help us win. And I just think, what an idiot. I'm so embarrassed of myself now looking back. But at the time, I was so disappointed and struggled to handle it. And so, I look back and regret that sort of stuff. I regret probably the way I challenged some of my coaches early on. And I take complete responsibility for it. The way I spoke to them, I think if someone did that to me, I'd want to give them a clip, and I regret that. And then in the coaching world, I think, without naming clubs, I probably regret, I've learned is a better way of putting it, that you can't change culture if you haven't got the right people. And so if you haven't got a group of leaders, people who are genuinely obsessed with putting the team first and progressing, you just can't change a culture, and you can't get buy-in to change. And that's not criticizing the people. There's different ways of doing things. Maybe it's the way the change is discussed, but I think it's been a really key learning that I think over my career playing and coaching, I think you can see reasonably quickly within maybe a week or two full time with them, whether you've got a group who are ready to pay the price. But equally, when you've got a group that aren't, it's very clear. It's very clear that they've got other priorities in life, whether it's social media or whether it's other stuff. And if you've got a core group of people who aren't truly obsessed with winning, actually, they get more excited about, doing other stuff. Maybe that's okay. I've yet to work with a group where that leads to continued success and achievement. I just don't think elite sport is made for that. Doesn't mean you can't enjoy yourself. I don't mean that whatsoever, but I just think your priority has to be your career for that short period that you get as a player.
All in for the team. Yep.
Definitely. And similarly, that's the pressure of a coach too, is that you need to be all in as well. And that means making sacrifice, which flies in the face of what I'm saying earlier about thinking about other things. And I don't mean put your work before your family. I will say that. I don't mean that. But you have to be thinking about, it's not like other jobs, elite sport and high performance. Like I said at the start, Alistair McCaw, I love his work. He writes about this. Being the best is not, or trying to be the best, it's not for everyone, and that's okay. But if you want to be that, then go all in. So I think that the key learnings as a coach have been around, if you've not got a group who's willing to pay the price, and the old quote, surround yourself with people on the same mission. If you're surrounded by people and you haven't got that group around you who are just as obsessed as you about winning and getting better, you're in the wrong place.
Yeah, and tough question. But on that topic, like when you mentioned, you can sort of tell intuitively within a week or two of being full time. Has there been a program, or if there hasn't, what would your belief be on it, where you feel like the leaders and the majority of the playing group are all in and they're obsessed to win, but the football department isn't, or vice versa? Do you think you can still get ultimate success, or do you need the key pillars of staff and the playing group to be all in and obsessed for team first success?
Yeah, good question. Actually, I think if you've got the players and especially the leadership group, if they are aligned and obsessed and desperate for success and willing to pay the price for success, I think you're 70%, 80% of the way there. I think we can sometimes overestimate our impact as coaches. Actually, I think at the true elite end, I understand, and I'm sure we'll get onto how we can add value physically from a strength and conditioning perspective. But I do think all of the different coaching areas, like players win games, players win leagues. There's no question. Great picture of Jim Radcliffe, a lovely picture who's used in presentations. He's one of the great strength and conditioning coaches of our time, and his his college football team is up there winning the trophy, and the banner's going off and the celebration, and he's got the great posture. And Jim stood there right in the background. And I think that picture personifies the kind of high performance department. Our job is to create the environment and give the program and help the athletes to achieve. We don't win premierships as coaches. You don't win. I never said I want to win a premiership as a coach. I want to help players win a premiership. I want to win one as a player. When you become a coach, I don't think it's about winning premierships. It's about helping players be the best they can possibly be to win a premiership. So I think the football department, yes, you need strong guidance. Probably depends on the makeup of the group as well. For example, when I talked about my time as a player at Munster, that team led itself because it was full of British Lions and Ireland internationals. So look at some of the players who've come out of it. Paul O'Connell, incredible name. Ronan O'Gara, Peter Stringer, you could go on. That 2006 Munster team didn't need a lot of coaching, really. They could have run their own show. As long as they knew what time the gym was, what time field was, I reckon they could have coached themselves. But then, in other teams, I'm not sure they could. Same in the NRL, you can look at the teams who've got such good senior leadership and such good elite players that it probably needs a little bit less input from the coaches. So I would say, there's the players are more important in that respect than the coaching staff.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. We better move into your topic, mate. And probably more specifically in the role that you are now, where you still got the finger on the pulse and more from a data technology and consultant space. But for those working in sports science, strength and conditioning, high performance roles, how do you find data can help inform decision making in those sort of high pressured environments?
Yeah, so I like analogies and metaphors for this sort of stuff with players and other coaches. I think the way I look at the data or consider the data is like the speed dials on your car. And so I'm a big fan of training at match intensity or above. Obviously, you can't do that permanently. You can't do that for the whole of the session, but I definitely think that stands to reason to me, logically, as the best way to prepare. If we can identify what is the worst case scenario. And when I say worst case, I mean the peak intensity. I'm not looking at it from an injury prevention perspective. I'm looking at it from a performance perspective. And then when we can identify what that looks like, how can we train at or above it? And so if we can track that sort of data, and then that becomes the speed dials on our car. So when we're driving really, really fast down the road, it's not just a straight road, unfortunately. And so we need to keep checking the speed dials. Now, if we don't check them at all, then we might go too fast, or we have no idea where we're at, right? And that's not going to end well. On the flip side, probably more pertinently, if we look at them too much and we obsess over them and we think that they're going to give us all the answers, which they're not, data will not give you the answers, then you're going to crash. And when you crash, it's going to be really ugly. And so I think, data or data, depending on where you are in the world, is incredibly important. There's a lot of things related to it that matter. I'm sure we'll touch on, but I think if I was to summarize it, there's probably two sides. I think there's first thing like I touched on there is you need to know what are you asking your team to do. And so I'll probably reference rugby league and rugby union primarily. But what does good look like? So, define success before you start. What does good look like? What are we asking them to do? It can't just be, well, we're going to win, right? You need to define what does good look like. And a good story I got from Melbourne Storm, Brian Norrie, incredible guy. You wouldn't call him the most athletic person in the world. He wouldn't. But you know what? He was an elite footballer. And he was. And he told me this story once around when he went to Craig Bellamy and asked him, what do you want me to do? Craig came to him and told him what his role in the team was. And it was, don't get beaten on your inside shoulder, make your tackles and get a quick play of the ball. And Nos wasn't the most powerful man in the world, He wasn't going to be able to just run into people and belt them and get a quick play of the ball. So he had to find a way of doing those three things that Craig wanted. There are only three things Craig told him to do. So he knew what success looked like for him. If he was able to achieve those three. So if you multiply that across the team, and then you look at the wider game model and philosophy of the coach, the really good coaches know what they want. Even you go to football and Jurgen Klopp, for example, at Liverpool and what he's managed to do there. a lot of people forget that after 4 years, most of the fans wanted to fire him because everybody was injured, or lots of players were injured and all the rest of it. But he knew what he wanted. He knew where he was going and how he wanted the team to play, defined what success looked like. And then he had to go about training the players to be able to do it. And if not, getting rid of some and signing some in who could do it. And eventually he got there and they became completely dominant. So that's one way I think data can be really important there, because that can help you to define what it is that you want to be. And then you can go about tracking and training it. And then if you go more classical strength and conditioning, I think for direct strength and conditioning, it's how do we measure the adaptation that we're prescribing an overload to create? And so your simple max strength measures, simple, all that sort of stuff, most of the people on the call would be well able to do. But I think it's important because we need to be constantly tracking progress. Are they getting better? Is what we're prescribing working? And then, it allows us to ask ourselves questions like, well, especially at the pointy end, not talking about developing athletes, but incremental gain of 1.25 or 2.5 kilos on a bench press, is that going to benefit this player and transfer to the field as much as maybe a 0.2 meters per second velocity increase at 80 kilos or 100 kilos bench press? So what is it that you're trying to get? You can only define that when you know what you're trying to deliver. What incremental improvement are you trying to make in the athlete specific to what the coach needs them to do? So a lot of that relies on a very clear vision. And I think data can help to inform where you are now, where you want to get to, and whether you're progressing to get there. It all starts for, what do you need them to do? And some coaches who aren't necessarily data smart or interested, in some, and that's fine too, by the way. I think find it quite hard to articulate what they want in a way that is trackable. And so then other methods need to be used in that instance. But I think the speed dials of the car is a good way of considering how and why data can be important.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm definitely borrow that one. I noted that one down. It's a good analogy for it. For those wanting to define success and build, like you talked about, the importance of a bullshit filter. I guess a filter for there's so much data points now in elite sport, which is great, but also it can become overwhelming. What would be your advice for sports science, strength and conditioning, high performance staff in terms of developing what is important, whether it be an adaptation aspect that you're looking for or for performance on the field? How do you go about having clarity on whether it be helping a player develop and what's an important objective measure for them, or if you're working with the consulting coaching staff?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and a good story around that I think defines my thinking on it is around how we track the intensity of a game. And so long time ago now, but I was getting frustrated by it's actually Craig Bellamy challenged me once, as he used to give me these special projects because he knew I was a bit obsessive around going and trying to find things out. And he said to me once, well, big thing was the arm wrestle. And I was saying, well, we practice arm wrestle all the time, but how do we know if we're getting better at it? And he was like, good question, go and find out. I was like, shit, okay. So I did, and I started looking at, I started just simply with a paper and pen measuring, because I was sat on the bench during games. When an arm wrestle was defined as 3 sets or more back to back without a break in play. As soon as it got to 3 sets from either team, obviously, both teams, that was classed as an arm wrestle. And then I would track how did they end. I started looking at that and I was like, wow, like Melbourne Storm, we're really good. When an arm wrestler gets above 6 sets, we're really good at winning it. I wonder why. Well, probably because they were very fit, they were very well prepared. They had some exceptional leaders, Billy Slater, Cam Smith, Cooper Cronk, those guys. But then I started looking at the data around it and how would we track it from a data perspective. And I was looking at the meters per minute, and that made sense to me, right? How many meters you complete in a minute? That sounds like the perfect metric to look at. But then I started, as I was talking to Craig and other coaches, Anthony Seabold was there at the time. It's probably how we first connected, actually, certainly on the data side of it. I was saying, but all the things that you say matter from a match perspective, like getting off the line, carrying the ball as hard as you can, push support. Melbourne should talk about flat and fast and everyone's in play on every play. None of them involve covering a lot of ground in a short period of time, really. There might be 5 steps, first 3 steps off the defensive line, for example, is something a lot of rugby league teams look at. And so I started looking at it, and the data doesn't capture the sensitivity of those actions that we say are of importance to performance. And so then there was some great research by, there's a great crew, Grant Duthie, Rich Johnson, Jace Delaney, Heidi Thornton, that crew, who were looking at the change in pace. I call it change of pace metric. A lot of people call it accel decel measurement, but essentially all it is looking at is every 10th of a second, what's the difference in speed? And then averaging that over a 60-second interval, 120, all the way from 1 minute to 10 minutes. And started looking at that data, which is challenging to process. You have to get the raw data and then process it, but those guys worked it out. It's really interesting to see that was a lot more sensitive, not just only to the position in some of the great peer-reviewed research they've put out, but that data set really allowed us to look at measuring all those moments that matter. So when you get hard off the line, that was good, because then you get hard off the line, you may or may not be involved in the tackle, but then you've got to get back to the line and reload and then do it again. So all of those actions that we value from a subjective perspective with the coaching team, they started reflecting in the sort of numbers that we were showing. And then it became, all right, now we can track physically what they're doing and whether it's good or not. Then it became, from a technical perspective, are they actually able to execute when the intensity is at that level? And so, data was pretty important there. But as with all of the different data sources that we collect, and there are a lot that are available, a big thing for me is in accuracy, firstly, and knowing error rates and knowing reliability. And so from that perspective, there's lots of research out there that can save us time and effort testing on, say, GPS tracking, for example, that we shouldn't be comparing RFID outputs to GPS outputs to optical tracking, for example, for player tracking data. Matt Tabman has released some good research on the optical versus GPS, and you just can't compare them. They're different. They're recorded differently, they're filtered differently, and there's an inherent difference, right? And then again, we go to GPS units. It's important to know from the research the inter and intra-unit differences. So we can solve that by making sure we give the same player the same unit every day, and we can take out that little, because when we're looking at these very small points of change, it's really important that we account for those differences. So yeah, making sure that we collect enough information on the reliability and validity, I think, is important. Then equally, things like, I love all the Valve devices. They've set up a phenomenal business there. I remember when it first started. It's really, really, really good, and they're solving some huge problems actually for S&C coaches in the field and physios alike. But it's important that when we do a node board test, for example, that we don't allow that flexion at the hip, because I've seen it in front of my eyes. I've done it for a long time, that it affects the output score. And so players are smart. Like they're constantly looking for ways to hit high scores because they're competitive beasts. And so if you allow that flexion at the hip, you'll increase the torque, which will give a higher score. But is it relative? No, it's not, because you've not got the lever side as well. And so again, standardization of testing becomes super important. Again, though, there's some great research out there. Dan Baker's done some great stuff with bands and velocity-based training. He's one of the greats. There's some good stuff out there from Jace Delaney and Rich Johnson and that crew. Grant Duthie around inter and intra-unit reliability, and they're pulling units on sleds to get those sorts of numbers that a lot of people don't have time to do. I think, yeah, definitely making sure that you're applying the correct filters, and what it is telling you, but equally what it's not. There's been, over the years, there's been all sorts of technologies, and I've seen in some of them that for example, you can do a number of jumps on a force plate and it'll tell you what training program you should do. I just don't see the research justifying that sort of statement. And yet, I've been involved in meetings where that's been attempted to be sold to me in a club, and I think that's part of. I think data is super important, but I think we always need to be able to justify with evidence how and why it works. And then on the flip side, if it's not, say, a software solution, we need to be making sure that we're tracking intra and inter-unit reliabilities and accounting for them if we can, if we're capable. If we're not, then we can't. You only do what we can.
Yeah, thanks, man. That's a thorough response and insight into how you go about the practical side of using the data in a real setting. When you went back to Bellamy with that, trying to quantify how to improve that aspect of the game, the arm wrestle, did that influence training decisions? Like already it was a strength by the sound of it, but how'd that go with decision making going forward? In that setting, did it mean you did more of it because it was an area that the Melbourne Storm were dominant with?
That's a really good and pertinent question, mate. And actually, any good high performance environment, which Melbourne Storm absolutely was then, and I believe still is, and they'll listen if you can provide evidence as to why something could help improve. So, no, I wouldn't say this contributed to Melbourne Storm winning more games, to be totally honest with you. I'd love to say it did, but I don't think it did. But what it might have done is provided a data point that was trackable. And I did it with the clubs I left when I left the Storm and continued. And it's just one small example of a way of trying to track whether we're getting better at something or not, right? But it was super interesting. And it was a really good conversation starter with the technical coaches on, what I really wanted to identify is, and I found it in some of the other clubs I worked at, that when we went 5, 6, 7, 8 sets back to back, we actually physically weren't capable. What was interesting about a club like that was someone like Cameron Smith, as they got to 5 and 6 sets, would often kick the ball. He would raise the speed of the game. I think it's a great quote from Calvin Giles that, anyone can slow the game down, but only the great teams and athletes can speed it up. And so what he would do is he was able to read the game because he was some sort of superhuman, but he was able to see that, and he didn't need me to collect data to tell him, by the way. He knew this way before I was there. That they're vulnerable. And if we raise it now, I know my team's going to go with me. I know that they're capable. I'm not sure they are. And that era of the game, he was just as incredibly good at that. And it's a great example to us physically that, he would tell you, all the coaches who've coached him would tell you, not necessarily the strongest or fastest player in the world from a strength and conditioning perspective. Bloody smart, incredibly good balance and core stability. But he knew that the role for the strength and conditioning team there was get the team fit enough and strong enough to be able to do what he needs them to do. And yes, Craig and all the rest of the coaches, but it was very clear that's what your role is, and then they'll execute it. You know what I mean? And so I think, did the data help? It probably helped to crystallize what we were good at. At other clubs I worked at, it helped to crystallize that we weren't quite ready yet. And in some instances, we're better if we don't go on a long arm wrestle. You hear often the commentators say in the NRL, they want to get them into an arm wrestle. Let's get them into an arm wrestle. At times I'll be thinking, actually, it's better if we don't, because we're not there yet. It takes time to develop really good conditioning. It takes time. And depending on where you're coming from, of course. And at times you're thinking, we're better as a short, sharp team. It's okay. We've got a different strategy, but we're better set piece, for example, at certain clubs I worked at, rather than going set for set continual. You look at teams now like Penrith Panthers, for example, they look like they can do it, both of them, exceptionally well there. Incredible, which is probably why they've gone back to back. But again, comes back to what I said at the start. When you know what you want to be, you can then track whether you're getting better at it or not.
100%.
I think that tool was an attempt at trying to do that.
That's awesome. Thanks for that. It's a great way of providing context on how you can apply it and the power that it can have. Is there ever been a technology in sport? Has there ever been a time where you've stripped it right back? Maybe you've consulted S&Cs or sports scientists to do so, or yourself, where you found that there was too much being tracked and you weren't actually applying enough of it. And how did you go about finding what was the most important markers to stick with, and how did you then also bin the ones that you felt that weren't really moving the needle?
Yeah, that's a good question. And actually it's in community sport or grassroots sport rather than true elite, let's say, or you could say they're elite grassroots, and it's in football and soccer, whereby I was talking to a team who they're big sell to me straight away when they found out sort of my background. And, I've been quite passionate about player tracking, and I've done a lot of research in that space and worked with stat sports for a while. But this team said to me, they were trying to tell me how great they were because they they were using GPS tracking on 12 and 13-year-olds, and it was this was the big sell. Look how good it is. And as an example, that the data that they showed me was, look how good our players are. They're running 7K in a game at 15. And I was saying, okay, tell me how running 7K in the game of football means you're a better player. And they said, well, it's work rate. And I said, okay, but is it? Like, do you know that it's work rate? And the long and short of the story was, as I kind of sat down and kind of asked them questions to get to what they were trying to do, it was because it made sense, and they'd read lots of stuff in articles from Premier League football managers and whatnot. It's work rate, work rate, work rate. And we all know that working hard leads to success. But in the game of football, for example, it's about how you can pass the ball in any direction. You can't do that in rugby league. You've got to work your way up the field, right? So in football, for example, it's a different game. And so, yeah, if you run to find space, someone can pass the ball to you. But at 14 and 15, the range of passing means that that's not quite possible. And long and short is what we found was that really the more you ran definitely didn't correlate with whether you were playing well or not. And so it came back to, I was saying to them, well, why are you doing this? So they were looking at it from a high performance perspective, less so than a load monitoring tool. But the truth be told, they didn't really know why they were doing it. They just did it because it looked professional to the parents. That's where we got to. And so I kind of tried to help give them some confidence that like, you don't need to do that. What could we track, or what could we do to help the players improve? And so what they ended up doing was bringing in a video session and helping to improve the players' education of how they could use the ball to find space. So I suppose in many ways I took out a data set for them and told them that, I reckon in consultation with the coaches, who were pretty pleased actually education of the players would be better. And that didn't mean that every now and again a player didn't need a kick up the backside for being lazy. Of course, that's always the way. But do you need to spend 20 grand on GPS and someone who's got to download it and all the rest of it every day to be able to do that? I don't think you do. Similarly, I've seen been on consultancy things to clubs who've got all sorts of 3D tracking and some really, really cool things in the gym that are tracking joint angles and all these great things. But I always go back to, again, Calvin Giles drives this in, but they weren't coaching. I wasn't hearing coaching cues. I wasn't seeing players hitting the same positions, say when they did a step up. I wasn't seeing toes up, preload the ankle. I wasn't hearing any actual coaching. It was down that path of, we're tracking stuff because it's cool and it's fancy, but they couldn't justify why they were doing it. It's probably back to where I started again. And if you don't understand why you're doing it and you can't directly show how it's helping you, you probably don't need to waste your time doing it. That's often, certainly when I look at reviewing programs or spending time with people who ask my advice, that's the first question I'll always ask is, if you can't justify it with evidence, probably don't bother. Like, go and find your time doing something better. And I definitely think keeping it simple, the lower down the tiers is super important. Don't have to get everything right. I think keeping it simple is really important. But again, don't get me wrong, I'm a big fan of the use of technology where appropriate.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good advice for anyone listening in, whether you're a parent or a coach, S&C. Like you and I've been guilty of it. You want what you think is the best and the best technology, but if it's not relevant to your environment, or your environment's not ready for it, or you don't really strong on your purpose, it's and the validity of what your purpose is to use it, then you might be just getting lost at trying to just do a whole host of things.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. What about from a problem solving point of view? You touched on a little bit before in terms of increasing the performance of working out why a team is successful, or an area of improvement, for working closely with tactical coaches as a sports science strength and conditioning coaches. What have been some methods that you found from getting them on board? Maybe perhaps at first they haven't had a good experience with a sports scientist in the past because it meant doing less training or whatever the experience might have been. How have you gone about sort of getting buy-in from the coaches to, I guess, believe and trust you with maybe you go into a new club, or you're working with a new assistant coach or head coach?
Yeah, excellent point. And I think I realized very early on that the job of a high performance coach, strength and conditioning coach, is to help to develop a player to enable them to play the way the coach wants them to play. And so I really enjoyed them for that reason, working with coaches who knew really clearly, probably come across already, but who knew really clearly what they wanted in each player. What's that person's strength? What do you need them to do? And then it's my job to go and find a way to help them do it better. And that's where the kind of passion, enthusiasm comes from. But as again, Calvin Giles always says, you make sure you write your plans for that in pencil, because they do change. But an overriding term I'd use is you've got to develop your coaching toolbox or your coaching kit bag, whichever way you want to put it. So there's lots of different ways to achieve the outcome that you're after. And one of the good ones that I remember thinking, I'll never learn this as a young S&C coach, was coach's eye. And I invested a lot of time into, because, you didn't really record things on a mobile phone when I started, and then review them back and the ability to go slow more. I remember when Coach's Eye, the app, actually first came out, I was like, wow. I was doing everything with Coach's Eye to try and improve. And I actually remember a funny story. I went out to GWS Giants once for a professional development day, and that because Dan Pfaff was over from the US. And I've got to say, like, I'd read a lot of his stuff, and he had these athletes running, and he kept saying, "Can you see that?" And he's saying to the group, "Can you see?" And I'm like, "What can he see? Like, I think he's running beautifully. This is perfect." And I thought I was a good coach at this point. I was thinking, he's running perfectly. And he's going, "Look at his right shoulder." And I'm like, "What?" Oh. And I'd see his right shoulder was fixing. He's going to have problems with his left adductor because of that. And I'm like, wow. And then, honestly, I was frantically writing notes, and I got home. I reckon it was about a month, because I recorded it. About a month after, I actually got all the points he made in 20 minutes. And I mean a month before I had been able to comprehend what. And I was just thinking at that time, oh dear, like I have got nowhere near the coaches. Like Franz Bosch, I had the same experience with Franz Bosch, even as recently at the Broncos, maybe 3 or 4 years ago. He came and spent 3 days with us, and he just kept picking things up. And I know he's one of the world's greatest, but he kept picking things up, and I was thinking, how is he seeing that? I've been doing this for 10 years and I cannot see that at all. He's been doing it a lot longer, I suppose. So I think that's a big one. And then, another probably ties in with that. Another important quote I like is, experience is what you get when you don't get what you want. And so when things go wrong often, I think referring to the high pressure environment you talk about, you have to be willing to accept things aren't going to work all the time. I think data helps in decision making, to bring a sense of confidence to decision making in high performance, in high pressure environments. I think it also helps coaches as well, but technical coaches. Like if you say, "Yeah, mate, they're really strong," or "Yeah, mate, I reckon they're super fit," because you always get that question. Any S&C coaches who work in sport will laugh when I say this, but the coach, we get beat in the last 10 minutes 2 weeks in a row, and the coaches will be, because you can't help it, it's human nature. Like, "Do you reckon we're fit enough?" And you're sat there thinking, "Yeah," but you haven't done a fitness test since the second week in preseason, or the middle of preseason. You're thinking, "Are we?" Like, there's no worse feeling. So again, some of the methods that I'd looked at is by training at certain game intensities throughout the week. There's some really strong evidence that helps you remain fit enough, and then you get a bye week and you test fitness, and sure enough, you were from an aerobic perspective, you were as fit as you thought you were. And so that became a really good way of checking it, kind of on a weekly, if not fortnightly basis. Are we actually training at an intensity that maintains that level of fitness we've developed in preseason? Because there's nothing worse than that question from a coach, and if you're hand on heart honest, you're not really sure, because everyone in the media is questioning, like, are they fit enough? They've lost 2 games, and they just can't concentrate at the back end of games, and it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy mentally for players. Whereas if you can say, "Hey, look, here's the evidence, we know it makes sense, you are fit enough," it means you can actually focus on the problem, which might be concentration, or it might be that your players aren't good enough, they need to improve. It might be that the tactics are wrong. It could be anything. It could be the weather. The player slipped because we don't know. So I think that helps in that's as high pressure as it gets for a strength and conditioning coach, and the coach says, "Are they strong enough?" Do you think they're strong? I think that definitely helps. Coach's eye comes down to knowing why. And then the other one I would definitely say, and this requires humility, is if you're ever the if you're ever the smartest person in the room, you're in the wrong room.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's super important in high performance departments to have people around you who are better than you at whatever they're doing. And I've been lucky enough to be in those environments a lot. Like, think about someone like Dan De Pasqua at Melbourne Storm, best strength coach I've worked with. He's an absolute gun. Also, probably the most humble man on the planet. You'll never hear him say he's good, but he is exceptionally good. I just constantly learning from him about strength. I still ring him today a couple of times a week, generally, and talk about strength training. He's constantly fascinating me. And then I was lucky from a sports science perspective. I had a guy called Bob McCunn, who we brought over. Never worked in rugby league before. It was exactly what I wanted at Melbourne Storm. At Brisbane Broncos. He came over and came from Hearts of Midlothian football club in Scotland. He interviewed exceptionally well. And he came over. I wanted someone who was really, really good in sports science. He had a PhD and whatnot, but didn't really know rugby league particularly well. I wanted him to think differently about the game and see what sort of data he could collect to show progress. And he did an amazing job there. And then similarly, Carmen Colomer, who took over from him, I think he's over in Perth now, ended up at Philadelphia 76ers after the Broncos. They're all genuine, and there's lots of others, but genuine experts in their field, and they were way better than me at their jobs, like way better. And so it's really important that when you've got a high performance department with people like that, and again, Storm are exceptionally good at creating environments like that, as are lots of other clubs, by the way. But when you've got an environment like that, then you've got to think in high pressure environments, the foundations that your department is built on. I think that allows you to answer the questions that you get hit with inevitably that make it a high pressure environment.
Yeah. To wrap it up, but perhaps you've answered already, but with those practitioners that really stood out as experts in their field, from a high performance manager's perspective, what does the sports scientist, like a successful sports scientist, sort of look like for you? I guess, what are their big rocks, so to speak, in terms of really assisting the high performance manager and I guess the high performance team from a physical preparation point of view?
Yeah. So from a sports science perspective specifically, I think in this day and age, it's the ability to manage big data sets. So I think if you're a sports scientist and you only really use Excel, it's probably worth looking into things like R, even into SQL and database, SQL query and database. I think data sets are getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Now, I can definitely remember Excel crashing on a number of occasions and killing 30 minutes of work that I'd done. But I think that's a really, really important one for sports scientists. I also, and this is just a personal preference, but I like sports scientists who train or who have a passion for training themselves. And I think that really helps them relate to what it is, say, that we're doing in the gym, what it is that we're doing on the field. And I think that's quite relatable. It's not necessarily it has to, but I find there's better sports scientists I've worked with have a passion for training themselves in whatever it is. I think I have to have an ability still to visualize data as well. I think that's super important because really data is only as good as the insights it generates. I love sports scientists, and Bob and Carmen were both exceptionally good at this, who account for error, who account for lack of reliability as well, because it becomes more reliable as a data set. I think that's super important. And then clearly the ones who are truly elite are the ones, in my opinion, who are able to come at you with lots of ideas. Also, things like, I've been watching the game and Bob used to do it all the time. I love those people sitting in the team meetings and listening to the coaches talk. Because remember, our job is to help to create players that do what the coaches need or are capable of doing what they need. And I used to love Bob would come out with the most random things from football, that he'd just think of, and he'd say, hey, have you thought about doing X, Y, Z? Because, Siebes up the front there is saying he wants them to get off the line square. Have you thought about doing this? Or we could potentially look at tracking that. Players never hear about that. So you're not data obsessed. It's not, all we ever do is track, But what you've got then is a sports scientist looking at how he can use data to answer a question on whether we're getting better or not. or whether we're doing what the coach wants. So I think that kind of critical thinking and confidence to speak up, which again is dependent on the environment that you create, I suppose, in high performance. But that'd be kind of the main things. And again, back to where I started with this whole conversation. For me personally, I think at the elite end of sport, you've got to be obsessed with getting better.
Yeah. Well said, mate. We'll move into the last section and start to wrap it up, but it's been massively valuable from speaking for myself and no doubt for the listeners. So thank you for sharing and providing, not only your philosophy is a big believer that success leaves clues, but also stories and in a practical setting. But from a personal point of view, from a professional point of view, what is a pet peeve, whether it be sports science, strength and conditioning industry perspective, or athletes that might not pack up their weights? What's a pet peeve that sort of fires you up when you're on the job?
I've got a few. I reckon probably lack of preparation is one that really annoys me. Meetings with no agenda. Just what's the point? And I got a quote I've stolen from someone. If you leave a meeting without something to do, you shouldn't have gone to the meeting. Just, meetings for meeting's sake, long hour and a half video sessions. I just don't know how valuable they are, but lack of preparation from a staff perspective, I think it's, you can't have that. It's not high performance or elite. And then, if you've got a meeting, it's nothing more frustrating than when you want to add value in a meeting and the leader of the meeting hasn't even taken 2 minutes to send out an agenda on what we're going to talk about, so you can be prepared. I think they're simple things that shouldn't happen. Yeah,
so they sort of go hand in hand. When you say lack of preparation, you're talking about staff members preparing sessions like warm-ups, conditioning blocks, and gym programs.
I'm probably referring to meetings. And if we're going to discuss, the loads from last week, and then we get into a meeting, but I haven't sent out an agenda.
Yeah.
And so we get to the meeting. I say, "How are the loads last week?" And the sports scientist saying, "Oh, yeah, he's trying to go off memory. He's not prepared to answer the questions I'm asking, but it's my fault because I didn't tell him. I should have been very clear." And that's just process. That's just organization. So that's why it's a pet peeve for me, because, that's what we refer to for the players. So that's an effort area. Really, it doesn't take talent to write an agenda or to give someone notice. It's just an effort area from a staff perspective. It's something where we should be better prepared, and all it takes is effort.
And for those, like when you're running a meeting, to make sure that every staff member that's in it actually walks away feeling like, that was productive. How do you sort of wrap them up? And I guess, how do you do you send it so that there's a pre-email or WhatsApp message with an agenda, and what happens post, or how do you wrap up your meetings to make sure everyone's on the same page and aligned?
Yep. So agenda is what we're talking about. Who is primarily the person we're going to ask that question, so they know we're coming to you. Feel the need to surprise people in meetings, and then end every meeting with either what have you learned if it's that type of meeting, or what are your next steps. I think that's super important. So for everyone in the room, like, what are your next steps? And it should be very rare, let's say, occasions where someone says, "Oh yeah, none from me."
Yeah.
Otherwise, that's on me, because I organized the meeting and I've wasted that person's time by bringing them in, and they've not got anything to do after the meeting. I could have just given them that information in an email and saved them. They could have done 20 minutes helping the program in another way. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. What about your favorite way to spend a day off? Well, I just bought a new house, 9 months ago. And at the minute, it's actually grafting in my garden, which needs a lot of work, and I'm too tight to pay for it or can't afford it. So it's basic laboring. I wouldn't say it's my favorite way, though. I'd say my favorite way is definitely watching my kids sport. And so I've got 2 daughters, passionate about female sport. In my role now, I'm trying anywhere I possibly can to help improve opportunity there. But I reckon as a parent, there's nothing better than watching them compete and learn life lessons, especially. I'm really strong on, again, it's all down to growth mindset sort of philosophy, but I'm really strong on them I hate them ever being perceived as the best player in their team, for example. Like, my youngest daughter is a very good football player, and I don't ever want her to be in a team. And I'm happy to tell her where she's the best in the team, because that's no good for them. Constantly I love seeing challenges put in front of them. I wouldn't say I love seeing them fail. I actually hate it, but I always stop myself and press pause and understand, how do I help them get through this challenge now? Because there's no question whatsoever that those failures build resilience.
Yeah.
And sport is a phenomenal metaphor for the rest of life. And how do you get over it? And it also instills that work ethic that I think my parents instilled in me. So it's hard in this world compared to 30 odd years ago when I was a kid. But I think that's my favorite way. That's what makes the hair stand up on the back of my neck when I see them, nervous in the car on the way to a game or to a trial. And then I love when they do get picked, but on the occasions when necessarily they don't get picked, I'm able to say, right, well, how can I help them learn the lesson from this? And always relate it back to what they could have done better. So unconditional ownership and effort areas. Well, did you really try your best? And if either of those, there's an improvement area, then that's what we focus on, rather than, the selectors pick their son instead, or their daughter instead, or whatever.
Yeah. This is more of a selfish question, but being a young parent myself, like my eldest son, he's only 3.5, and daughter's, like I mentioned, off airs 5 weeks. So they're a while off playing competitive sport. But did it take a while for you to shift your coaching, if you call it, or parenting method, like those drive homes after a disappointing loss or whatever it might be, when you've been in an elite environment for so long? Or did it actually help you because you've got, the coach's eye, you've got empathy with those experiences? Like, how did you sort of juggle the parenting with an elite coaching background?
You have no idea how pertinent that question is. And I'll tell you why. Because I'm used to, because in elite sport, you get used to, I didn't realize it until I left, but you get used to watching games and kind of being silent. You don't commentate through games because you're watching. Often, I used to in orange shirt in the NRL, for example, you're watching like one play behind often, see if anyone's injured, whether you need to go on and help them, or you're watching effort areas because you're a physical performance manager and they really matter to your job and that sort of stuff. And so you get used to watching games in silence and constantly watching effort. That's all I ever watch is effort, effort, effort. I'm not looking at the fancy kid who scores in the top corner. And so with that in mind, I find it really challenging with parents who haven't had my background. It's not their fault. They're wonderful people. I find it hard to watch games where they see different things to me. They see the kid who dribbles through and then loses the ball and say, great work. And I'm like, well, actually should have passed to his teammate because it's a team. I find that challenging. And the second thing, and why it's so pertinent, is I'm a genuinely average coach with my own children from a strength and conditioning perspective. I find it, I've never coached young kids before, that young. And I find it at 13 and 15, I find it insanely challenging to coach them. I
can imagine.
And it's a complete negative on me. It's totally my fault, but I find it really, really hard to flick the switch and accept that they can't do stuff, or that they have a little whinge, or I'm like, oh, I just can't handle it. Yeah. And so I don't, I don't do it. I guide them. I give them lots of opportunity. It spoils my relationship with them necessarily. I reckon if I treat them like an elite athlete now, and in fairness to them, Jack, I was in 22 years in elite sport. They're only 13 and 15. They're only, until I left 2 years ago, their only insight into dad's work was coming into Parramatta Eels training and school holidays. And they were there every day with me, just sat helping cook the barbecue and whatever. So they kind of, especially the youngest one, they're kind of grown up in that world.
Yeah.
And that's brought some challenges too, because, they're, and it's so weird, but she kind of used to, I remember once she pulled up a player at Parramatta Eels training for missing the line. She was like maybe 8, maybe less actually. She might have been 6. And she said, oh, that player missed the line. And he was literally bent over vomiting because he trained, conditioning drill. And so that sort of mentality has been a challenge for her to accept that that's not what preparation looks like for kids.
Yeah.
So it's been really interesting, but I'm not a good coach of my own kids from a S&C perspective. I think that the technical side of it, because they both, play football and one plays touch footy. I think I just coach effort areas. So, that's easy. You don't need knowledge of the game necessarily to do that. It's all about effort areas and
Yeah. Thank you, mate. That's a great insight.
Good luck.
It's been well over an hour, so I appreciate your time and sharing with us insights both from a professional but personal with parenting. That was a great way to wrap up the podcast right there. So thank you so much for tuning in. For those listening to the podcast that want to get in contact with you, mate, maybe they've got a follow-up question. Is there a place they can get in contact, whether it be email or socials? If so, whereabouts is the best place to go?
Yeah, probably socials is easier. I do like Twitter actually. I don't post very much, but I certainly get a lot of information and links from there. I think it's PDevs too. But equally, I'm happy to take emails. Again, I touched on at the start the amount of people who helped me. There's guys over here working the field, Jeremy Hickmans and Lachlan Penfold. I think you've got on next week. I came over and visited them when I was an S&C coach from the UK, and can't tell you how helpful they were to me, especially Jez being from England himself. He was an absolute inspiration to me when I was a young fella. And there's loads of people who've helped me. So my actual personal email is devs, devs4858@yahoo.com. I'm happy for anyone to email me there, and I'll help out any way I can.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah, for those listening in that might be driving, which I know is quite a popular avenue for podcasting, we'll add Paul's Twitter as well as email address in the show notes. So it's easy for you to access at the end of once you park the car. But yeah, thanks again for tuning in, mate. Really appreciate it. I got heaps out of it. And for those that tuned in the live halfway through, as you know, you can watch the full recording on our YouTube channel until we post it in an upcoming Wednesday on our podcast directories. And our next live chat is actually Lachlan Penfold, which is next Tuesday, November 1st. So make sure to tune in for that one at 1 o'clock. I'll see you guys then.